In 1901, just to pick on one little thing, he campaigned for establishment of a textile factory in the city of Dubrovna, that's Belarus, to improve economic status of Jews in Russia. And it had 2,000 Jewish employees. Just to give you one example of what he did, he wasn't just concerned with their religious status and supporting them religiously. He was interested in helping Jews in whichever way possible, materially, economically, and of course, spiritually as well. He would travel to St. Petersburg and Moscow to fight for the welfare of Russian Jewry. In 1904, in the Russo-Japanese War, he spearheaded his father's campaign. His father initiated the campaign to provide Jewish soldiers on the Eastern Front from matzahs for Pesach. And then all you had these pogroms that swept through the Pale of Settlement, and he was sent by his father to Germany and Holland to get them to intercede on behalf of Russian Jewry. And he participated in various rabbinical conferences, and he incurred the wrath of the Tsarist regime. Between 1902 and 1911, remember he was born in 1880, so he's 22 years old. He's in his 20s when he was arrested within that period 4 times by the Tsarist regime. Why was he arrested? Because he was trying to stop pogroms. That's a crime, I guess, if you are the Tsar. But he was eventually set free because they couldn't really pin anything on him. They were not as good as the communists in doing that. In 1920, his father passes away. This is shortly after the revolution, and now the communists are in charge. But there was one group that didn't like what he was doing. A Jewish group. They were called the Yevsektia, the Jewish section of the Communist Party. They were not just virulent communists, they were the greatest haters of Jews and Judaism. They were worse than the Russian anti-Semites, and the Russian anti-Semites perfected that profession of anti-Semitism, and they were the anti-Semites' anti-Semite, and they went ruthlessly to destroy every vestige of Judaism in Russia. And not only that, but they had him arrested in 1927, because the Rebbe, as he was called, even the communists called him the Rebbe. That's interesting, but that's a separate story. But he was establishing underground schools for children. He had about 600 underground schools, the length and breadth of the Soviet Union. He established shachtim, ritual slaughterers, to provide kosher food. He had mohalim, people doing circumcision secretly. A grandfather of one of my classmates, one of my colleagues, was once blindfolded and taken hostage in a car, driven for hours to who knows where. They take him out of the car, they bring him into a house, take off the blindfold, and there's a little baby there. We want you to circumcise our son. These were communist officials, Jewish communist officials, who wanted the son to have a bris, but they didn't want the male to know where he was. Because if they ever torture him, he couldn't reveal where he was. And he did this bris. This was something going on throughout the period that the Rebbe was in Russia. A colleague of mine's father, the same one I mentioned before, would go from town to town at the behest of the Rebbe, forging documents, telling the mayors of the town that the central government in Moscow wants you to build a mikveh here. So they built mikvahs across who knows how many cities in Russia. It took them about a half year until they discovered the Rus. And some of the mikvahs were eventually shut down. But some other mikvahs did survive, secretly. This was all being done under the nose of the Yevsektia, and they decided once and for all, we have to put a stop to this. So he was arrested, he was sentenced to death, he was supposed to be shot within the very day he was arrested, but there was a whole story mix-up, and that caused him not to be shot. There was intervention from the United States. Senator Burrow of Idaho was the one who was most instrumental in getting the Stalinist regime to relent, and they commuted the death sentence to I think 10 years slave labor. That was commuted to 3 years exile in the Ural Mountains, and that was commuted after about a week and a half to be free. He was freed, and not only was he freed, but he was also allowed to leave the Soviet Union with his entire family and with his extensive library. He had one of the largest collections of Judaic, about 30,000 volumes, that they allowed him to take out of Russia. There's another part of his library that was in another place that is still in Russia, and there's efforts being made to try to get that out of Russia. Russia doesn't want to give it away because they consider it to be a Russian treasure, and they don't want it to be taken to the United States. At any rate, he was allowed to leave. But even after he left, he kept on working for Soviet Jewry. Clandestinely, he had his shluchim, his emissaries throughout Russia, bringing whatever help they could give the Jewish people materially and spiritually. When he left, even before he left Russia, he already established a network of schools in Poland. He knew that he's going to have to go to another country to reestablish Judaism. So he started a network of schools in Poland, and it became a very popular network. And some of my teachers were graduates of that school. But not only that, it even attracted people from the United States. One of those people was my father, of blessed memory, who traveled to Poland, to Otwocz. That's a suburb of Warsaw where the yeshiva was. And when did he go there? July 1939. Perfect timing. He saw the first bombs falling on Warsaw.
And where was he traveling from?
My father's family? The United States. My father was born in the United States. His parents came from Russia, but he was born here in this country, and he went there to be next to the Rebbe, to study in his yeshiva. My father was already an accomplished scholar, but he wanted to be with the Rebbe, and a few weeks after he got there, he was forced to flee. My father would always speak with great pride how he was the first person who was instrumental in getting the previous Rebbe out of Nazi-occupied Poland. Before my father left, the previous Rebbe says to my father and his colleagues who went with him, he says, every bullet has an address, and the address is not you. You will not be harmed. And my father told me the story that he was and that he also told my father, you're going to Riga now. I'm a Latvian citizen. The previous Rebbe lived in Riga after he left Russia, before he moved to Poland. And he said, I want you to go to Mordechai Dubin. He was a high-ranking Latvian official and a chassid as well. He was a member of the Latvian parliament. And he did tremendous favors for everyone. I want you to go to him, and he should start the ball rolling to try to get me out of Poland. And that's the beginning of a long process where the previous Rebbe was saved by a Nazi. Somehow the American government got in touch with a man called Canaris, Admiral Canaris. He was the head of the army intelligence, like the CIA, right? And they were at odds with the SS. And Canaris didn't like Hitler, and he tried to kill Hitler eventually, and he was executed. So he was sympathetic to the Americans and maybe even to the Jews. Some people suggest that he might have been a descendant of Marranos. That's why he had a soft spot for Jews. And he sent a Nazi soldier whose father was Jewish, and Hitler gave him special dispensation. He was an honorary Aryan, even though his father was Jewish, and he came to Poland, and the previous Rebbe was hiding. This is during the bombardment of Warsaw, and he finally found the previous Rebbe, and he took him out of Poland at the risk of his own life to get him to Berlin. And from Berlin, they got him to Riga, Latvia, and from Latvia, he went by ship, came to the United States in 1940. When he came in 1940, he was a broken man physically. He suffered from MS, he was paralyzed, he suffered from many other ailments. Someone I know who knew the previous Rebbe very well told me that if you can think of an illness, he had it. He suffered strokes, he suffered heart attack, he suffered from MS. He came in with a wheelchair. Actually, he had been in America 10 years before that. He had visited Israel and the United States. He was in America for 8 months. And his idea was to see what American Jewry needs. And that's what gave him, he took the pulse of American Jewry. Now he was settling in the United States, and this was the time of the war. It was a terrible time. He was heartbroken by all the suffering and pain. He did everything in his power to try to save Jews early on when it was still possible to get people out. When he was given a report into the war that many of his Hasidim put to death in Riga, they took all of the Jews left in Riga, they herded them into 3 adjoining synagogues and burnt it down. One person escaped and told the story. When he read that letter, he got a heart attack. That's how sensitive he was to the suffering and pain. But he did everything in his power to help the Jews who were still in Russia who needed help. Even as he was doing all this, the previous Rebbe was the most prolific letter writer that I ever heard of. He wrote an estimated 100,000 letters to thousands of people all over the world. And the letters were essentially letters for telling people what to do, how they can help other people. And some of them are scholarly letters. There's one letter he wrote to his daughter, a historical letter. It's a small letter, 150 pages. So he was the most prolific letter writer. He also wrote prolifically on Hasidic philosophy. We have about 30 volumes of his teachings. Where he got the time to write all this, when he was running from one place to another, he was either in prison, he was running from one place to another, he was involved in conferences, but he was an extremely prolific writer. In fact, he wrote a diary from the age, I think, of 11 until almost the last day of his life. Not the last day, because that was Shabbos. He wrote a diary of everything that happened in his life. We only have bits and pieces of it that he allowed to be published, but there's probably many volumes of it as well. So he came to the United States, and this is where we take up the topic of, is there any hope for Judaism in America? Now, there was a common refrain that Jews in America would say, and everyone seemed to subscribe to it, and it was in Yiddish: America is nicht anders, or is nicht anders. America is anders. America is different. Don't try to import European Judaism to America. America is not the same. You can't live as a Jew in America the way you lived as a Jew in the old country. It's not going to work here because America is different. And even his own followers who lived in America, you see, many thousands of Russian Jews came to the United States, including my own grandparents, in the early part of the 20th century. They were fleeing Tsarist oppression and the military conscription. Jews were sent to the battlefield. They were cannon fodder. So the Jews who came here, many of them were Chabad followers, and they established Chabad synagogues in the entire Northeast. There were several hundred Chabad synagogues. One was in Buffalo, established in the early 20th century. And they were called different names. One name was Lubavitcher, one was Nusachari, whatever the names were. These were originally Chabad followers. And they tried to dissuade the previous Rebbe from trying to import his old style Chabad customs and behaviors from the old country. It's not going to work over here. And the previous Rebbe said he's not getting off the ship that brought him here until he hears that they established a Chabad yeshiva, which all of his supporters in America told him, it's not going to work here. You can't start a yeshiva here. This is not Europe. This is not Lubavitch. This is not Russia. This is America. America is different. And his slogan was, America is nicht anders. America is not different. And he proved to be right, because he created a revolution of Jewish education, which other organizations followed. For example, in 1940, when he came here, he immediately set out to establish Jewish day schools. Some day schools were afternoon schools, some were morning schools. One was established, I think it was in 1942, here in Buffalo, New York. My principal, I went to Chabad school in Worcester, Massachusetts. Rabbi Fogelman was the principal of the first Chabad school here in Buffalo. And that it morphed into a day school, and then when Kadima opened, it folded. But then, now, of course, we have our own day school that is a thriving day school. But throughout the entire Northeast, he established day schools. A year or two later, another organization started which competed in a good way and started a network of schools called Torah U'Masorah, which has hundreds of day schools under its banner. Chabad has hundreds as well now. So he created a whole revolution of Jewish education for little kids, as well as for teenagers and college level. He started that revolution, which others emulated to his satisfaction, of course. He wanted others to compete. He started an organization called Kahat. Kahat is a publishing arm, publishing children's magazine. There was a magazine called Talks and Tales that was intended for children. It was started, I think, in 1942, if I'm not mistaken. Torah Masorah started another magazine to compete with it in a year or two later. And it's interesting, just a little anecdote. In the 1960s, I think it was, the Torah Masorah competing magazine was having financial trouble, and they were about to fold. And the Rebbe discovered that was going to happen, so the Rebbe gave them thousands of dollars to keep them publishing. It's like what are two competing stores? It's like Gimbel's giving Macy's money to keep them afloat. That's dated, of course. So the only interest was to spread Judaism in America, and even if it means you have to support your competitor, so be it. You want more competition, not less competition, when it comes to spreading Judaism. And when he established this organization, plus another few organizations, a social network organization called Machne Yisrael, an educational arm called Merkaz L'Inyanei Chinuch, he appointed the present Rebbe, the previous Rebbe's son-in-law, as the head of these organizations, which did a tremendous amount of influence, had tremendous amount of influence over Jewish education throughout the United States. Before he passed away in 1950, he already laid the foundation for a network of schools in Morocco, Tunisia, Israel, and Australia. Well, you say Israel, why did he need to establish schools in Israel? See, France, right? France as well, can't forget France. And Israel. Why did he have to establish schools in Israel? Because in Israel, you had a choice of either going to the Haredi, the Orthodox, the ultra-Orthodox schools, or you go to the government-sponsored schools, which had a much lighter Judaic content. So he laid the foundations for a network of schools that dealt with some very secular Jews who would give them a good Jewish education. In 1950, the age of 70, close to the age of 70, he passed away on a Shabbos morning. Exactly a year later, his son-in-law succeeded him as the Rebbe. And from that time onward, the Chabad movement had an exponential growth. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the impact of both Rebbies on America. Both Rebbies had a lot of things in common. They were consumed with love for every individual, for every Jew in particular. The love, the Ahavat Yisrael was something that was unparalleled, to go to the greatest lengths to help another person. And if we had time, I would tell you dozens of stories, if not hundreds of stories, of both. But let's talk a little bit about the American mentality and how they affected it. Both Rebbies embraced American ideals and mentality up to a certain point. For example, what does America stand for? Freedom. This country was established to provide religious freedom to everyone. The Rebbies cherished that freedom and said that freedom is not enough. You have to take advantage of it. If someone says, I'm living in a free country, big deal. You're living in a free country. What are you doing with freedom? If you do nothing with freedom, it's a wasted freedom. Freedom means that you have the opportunity to do the things that you know you should be doing. So while America is about freedom, The Rebbe said, we're going to take advantage of that freedom. See, Jews were afraid because of anti-Semitism. I remember as a kid, when I would go to the park, I would wear a baseball cap. Why? Because if I wore my yarmulke, I could be beaten up. That was something, and I'm only 39. So everyone could tell stories like that going to school, you were beaten up or threatened to be beaten. You certainly would be, you would hear all sorts of anti-Semitic epithets hurled at you. So there's a lot of reasons why Jews were afraid to take advantage of the freedom. The Rebbe was not afraid. He was fearless. Both Rebbes, and I'm lumping them together because they may have had different styles, and if we have time I could explain what those different styles are, but they both shared that obsession with taking advantage of freedom to utilize that freedom to spread Judaism and Jewish values. America is a land of individualism, yet united, e pluribus unum. You make one out of many. So the question is, do you focus on the many or do you focus on the one? And what happens is that some people focus on the one. Everyone should be the same, the melting pot. We should all become Americans, whatever that means. You have to love football, I guess, and apple pie or baseball. I don't know. I think it's changing. To be American means you have to change your whole culture and abandon whatever culture you had before. So now we have the other extreme. We have people saying that, no, we're not Americans, we're whatever we are, we're multiculturalism. And in its extreme is you would abandon the whole concept that we're all Americans. It's not easy when you have two competing ideals to know how to create a good balance between them. Most people are not balanced. Most people will either gravitate towards one extreme or the other extreme. The Rebbe and the previous Rebbe did not have that problem. They knew the right balance. They believed that we are one country, one people. If you remember the pogrom in Crown Heights, where Mayor Dinkins then came to the Rebbe, I have it written down over here, and he asked for a blessing for peace between the two peoples, Jews and blacks. And the Rebbe told him, don't say two peoples, one people, under one government and under one God. Now the Rebbe is the last person to say we should all be one and everything that we do should all be the same and we should melt. But he recognized that there's an important aspect of the fact that we are one people. We are one American people under one God. At the same time, we never lose our individualism. That balance is a crucial balance. And when we go to one extreme or the other, we lose the greatest gift that we have here in this country. No time before in history has a country given so much freedom, religious freedom in particular, to its people. And that's important to recognize that we are one people and we embrace that unity. We're patriotic, we believe in one America, but we also believe in preserving the differences. And individuality. One Hasidic master once said, if I am I and you are you, then I am I, and you can be you. But if I am you and you are I cannot be I, nor can you be you. Another thing about American culture that the Rebbe used to take advantage of, the Rebbe said that America is about publicity. Madison Avenue, everything has to be out loud, out in the public. There are no inhibitions in America. You share everything except your bank account. Someone once said, you go into a bar, within 10 minutes, you'll share the most intimate things about your life with someone. But dare that person ask you, how much money do you have in your bank account? They'll never share that. So we're very open, and that's a positive thing to a certain extent, of course. We're an open people. We like to share our knowledge. We like to share our good fortune. We like to talk about our accomplishments. We like to advertise. That's Madison Avenue. That defines America. So the Rebbe says, take advantage of that. Take advantage of that and advertise Judaism. and show your belief in Judaism and your adherence to it and your love of it in public. Put up public menorahs for Hanukkah. Go in the street with a what's called a mitzvah tank. It's interesting, one yeshiva student, after a few years of going on mitzvah tanks, he calls up a place that rents RVs, and he says, "Can I rent a tank?" In his mind, he thought the only thing that's called a tank is the thing that you use to go out to put tefillin on with Jews in Manhattan. So he thought, and they say, "A tank? We don't rent tanks. You have to go to the Pentagon to find out how to rent a tank." So the Rebbe sent out tanks to spread Jewish practice, to put tefillin on people, to have women light Shabbos candles, and all the other mitzvahs that go along. This is done in public. No embarrassment. We go in public places with a lulav and esrog on Sukkot, and we meet hundreds of thousands of Jews all over the world in the street, and they make the blessing. I told a story once before about a Jew whose life was saved. He was prevented from committing suicide when he was grabbed at a Hanukkah menorah lighting and dragged into the dance around the menorah, and that gave him life and spared his life from committing suicide. These are things that are perfectly American. The idea of not being embarrassed, no inhibitions. Of course, that can be taken the wrong way as well. So the balance is the crucial thing. In other words, show your pride in your Jewish identity. They took Judaism out of the synagogue and brought it to the home and even the street. America celebrates technology and innovation. Where do all the latest discoveries come from? Of course, Israel is taking over, I think, but it originally came from the United States. Some very religious people shunned technology. They said technology is treif, it's not kosher. You shouldn't use technology because it's modern, and modern is synonymous with treif, not kosher. The Rebbe's opinion was just the opposite. The Rebbe encouraged technology. The first person in the world to have his teaching spread by telephone hookup was the Rebbe. In the 1970s, they had a whole system. This is before internet, before all these other innovations. They had a system where every Chabad center in the world was able to hear the Rebbe speak by telephone hookup. Today, it's no big deal. I mean, but in those days, it was an innovation. The first Jewish organization to have a website on the web, on the World Wide Web, on the internet, was Chabad. Why? Because the Rebbe encouraged, take advantage of technology. Technology is here for a reason. The reason is it's here to spread Jewish knowledge. God says, if technology is here, I'll let you use it for your personal things as well. But the reason why it's here is for Judaism. So that was another thing, taking advantage of American innovation, ingenuity. The Rebbe, when someone would graduate, would get involved in Judaism when they were in their college years, and they discovered Judaism, and they wanted to quit college because they found an interest in Judaism, and to them it was more appealing than what they were studying in college. And they would ask the Rebbe, and the Rebbe says, "No, I want you to finish your degree and then get a higher degree, and get a higher degree, and be the best in your field." So while the Rebbe didn't encourage college education for his run-of-the-mill Hasidim, someone who was interested in Judaism and was involved in college studies, the Rebbe wanted them to reach the top in their field and to use it for spreading of Judaism. The very last discourse that the previous Rebbe issued, and actually he issued to be studied on the day that was his grandmother's yahrzeit, and he passed away on that day as well. And this is seen as his last will and testament, and it's the theme that the Rebbe would repeat every year. It's based on a verse in the Song of Songs, where the text reads, "I came to my garden God is talking metaphorically, and he's saying, I came to my garden. So the Midrash says that when God created the world, his presence was palpable in this world. But because of the sins of Adam and Eve and so on and so forth, Cain and Abel, the divine presence withdrew one level at a time until it went up to the seventh heaven. And then when Abraham came along, he brought it down from the seventh heaven to the sixth heaven, Isaac to the fifth, and so on and so forth, until he came Moses, and Moses was the seventh generation. He brought the divine presence down to earth. That's what the Midrash says. How did he do it? By giving of the Torah and by building the Mishkan, the tabernacle. That's where God is now accessible here in this world. So the Rebbe, the previous Rebbe, and the Rebbe focused on that Midrash, that we are the seventh generation, and our role is to bring God into the physical world. What does that mean? That's a very nice, lofty way of expressing things, but what does it mean in practicality? So the Rebbe said what it means in practicality. Make Judaism part of your everyday life. Just like you get up in the morning and you brush your teeth and you bathe, you get up in the morning and you put on tefillin if you're a man. You say your prayers. It's part of life. It's not an abstract thing put away, compartmentalized. It is part of your real life. You want to go out in the street, bring Judaism to the street. It's not in the heaven, Judaism. Judaism is down here on this earth. And that's what the two Rebbies emphasize over and over again. I just want to conclude with a story. The story happened during the lifetime of the previous Rabbi, Rabbi Yosef Yitzchak. And the story is about his son-in-law, the present Rebbe. The present Rebbe told the story. He said he just came down from the study of his father-in-law. His father-in-law's study was in the second floor of 770 Eastern Parkway. And he came down and he said, I just had an audience with my father-in-law, and I want to share it with you. He said this to two students. He says, I had a custom, whenever anyone came into the synagogue, even Jews who were not observant at all, they didn't observe Shabbos, they had their stores open on Shabbos, they didn't keep kosher, but whoever came in, people would come in to say Kaddish or something like that, I would greet them, smile to them, show them a lot of love and affection, and really make them feel comfortable and at home. And I was chastised by some elder rabbis who said to me, that's a bad thing you're doing. Don't do that. Why? Because these people will think, you see, you're showing them how much you love them the way they are, they're never going to change. So it's not a good idea. On the contrary, berate them. But certainly don't show them love and affection. And the Rebbe says to himself, says to these students, I felt that what I was doing was right, but since these were older people telling me, maybe I'm wrong. So I decided to ask my father-in-law if I should continue in my errant ways to show love to everyone, even people who are not observant and people who might not become observant, who knows. And my father-in-law told me the following. He says, a parent has a child, and a parent loves the child infinitely. You would think there's no more room for any more love. Comes a second child, and the parent shows infinite love to the second child, and the third child. And then a child is born with a serious disability. Then the parent shows a unique love more than the other children. As much as you can't love more than you loved before, somehow, when a child is born with a disability, the love is much more pronounced. The love is unique. He used the Yiddish word for it, eigenartig. It's hard to translate that word. I think unique might be the best translation. He says when someone, a Jew, doesn't do a mitzvah, that's a spiritual disability. So God loves that person even more. God shows a unique love to that person. And then my father-in-law told me, you do what God does and continue doing what you were doing. And that's the foundation, another balancing act. You see, and this is what attracts people to Chabad in this country. I think that's the secret of how Judaism will succeed and prosper and grow, because there's two extremes over here. There's always a conflict between accepting a person who you don't agree with. Someone comes into this room and says, Rabbi, I disagree with everything you said. I remember once in one of my classes at UB, a student, a very bright student, says to me, Rabbi, you're crazy. She still got an A. I bent over backwards to make sure she'll get the A, that I shouldn't be affected by her insult. But could you like a person like that who totally disagrees with you and thinks what you're doing is off the wall? And it's very hard. So what happens when there's a conflict between accepting another person and the values that you accept, you will compromise one or the other. You have Jews who cannot accept another Jew who is not observant. They just can't. They might be polite to them, but they just can't embrace the Jew who is not observant, because they have very strong commitments to Judaism, to Jewish practice, and that person doesn't practice. If you put it in political terms, you have people who belong to different political parties, and there's so much hatred going on because that person disagrees with me. I disagree. I think they're crazy. So we can't accept a person if they're different from us. That's a human flaw. If someone doesn't agree with me, human nature says I have to reject that person. But then I'm told I shouldn't reject that person because that person is a human being. If it's a Jew, it's a Jew. So what happens? I go to the other extreme. You have people go to the other extreme. They say, we don't care about standards. That person doesn't have my standards, so maybe I don't need my standards. I'll be lax about my standards. How could you be obsessed, radical about your standards, and radical about embracing people who disagree with your standards and oppose it? That paradox the Rebbies resolved. They were able to show no compromising, unmitigated embracing of every detail of Judaism, not compromising one bit. But at the same time, not compromising one bit about embracing every Jew, no matter how far they are from Judaism. Even if you know, which is something we can't know, but even if you would know, Elijah the prophet would come to me and say, you see that Jew over there? I'm not pointing at anyone, God forbid. You see that Jew over there? He will never change. He's a lost cause. You still show unmitigated love to that person and embracing them without any condition attached to it. Sure, you would want the person to change. Everyone wants people to change to conform to what you think is right. But that's not the condition for which you accept or don't accept someone. That ability to synthesize the two, the paradox, is the art form that the previous Rebbe established, and the Rebbe took it and he went with it even to greater heights. And that's the secret of how Judaism will prosper in this country, because if Jews could recognize, yes, we are different and we don't always agree, in fact, we almost never agree, sometimes you can get someone to change and agree, and even if we can't, we still embrace that person. Don't compromise the law, the commandments, and we don't compromise the love and the acceptance of the other person, the embracing of the other. Any questions? Yes?
No question, just a comment. The Chabadniks were the first one to take Judaism back to Russia.
Right.
With all kinds of...
Okay, now, right, and right now in Russia, the dominant Jewish community is Chabad. There are Chabad in, I think, 150, 160 communities. Moscow itself has about 25, 30 Chabad houses, just Moscow itself.
But they
And-
took such a chances in order to take out the prayer books, and many people took it for them.
Oh, that
That's
was
how
in
it
the
started.
olden days, yeah. People would secretly
Well,
take things.
You know,
and
this
leave
is the
prayer
last,
books.
25, 30 years or something.
Yeah, that was
like
then,
that.
yeah. The Rebbe always had, until the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Rebbe had an underground movement that existed throughout Russia. One of the heads of the Mossad, the Israeli CIA, would come to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe would debrief him for 7 hours. And he said, and this is published, he said that the Rebbe seemed to know more about Russia than I did, what was going on in Russia. He got me to tell him everything that I knew. He divulged zero to me. The Rebbe was able to keep a secret. But he was very sensitive to people who publicized things about Russia that could have harmed the Jews in Russia. And the Rebbe was the one who predicted the downfall of the Soviet government. When Gorbachev came to power, the Rebbe told one of his followers, Professor Branover, to call up his friends in Russia to tell them that things are going to change. They're going to let the Jews out, and they're going to change their policy towards Jews in Russia. And when he went back to the Rebbe, he says, people are telling me things are going to get worse. And the Rebbe says it's going to take a little bit of time, but things are going to change, and they did, of course. And I'm shocked that people are not overwhelmed by the incredible change that happened in our own lifetime. Everyone could think about if you're born after the Holocaust, what are the most momentous of things that happened in our lives? You could say the establishment of the State of Israel, the Six-Day War. I would put the collapse of the Soviet Union equal to those two things, if not maybe even more. Because who could have imagined that this empire that was so powerful and so ruthless would just collapse in a bloodless coup? That was something that nobody anticipated except for the Rebbe. But that takes us off the subject. The main point that I'm trying to make here is that the Rebbe was able to show the synthesis between modernity, American way, and Judaism, and that the two can live and coexist together.
You talked about technology. I can remember in the 70s, my dad used to watch, they used to have on cable like public
Right.
access. And they used to broadcast the Rebbe speeches
Right?
on the public access. Of course, then there wasn't translation, but he used to listen to him talk for hours on the public broadcast
Right.
station on the first cable that we had way back when.
Yeah. I did the translation once. I was the simultaneous translator. One time they gave me the honor to do it.
Well, the reason that I watched them, even though after a while they had people telling in English what he was saying. But
Yeah, that's afterwards.
I watched them was that I realized that this was a holy man, that what he was saying was something that, even though I didn't understand it, I felt his neshama.
Right.
You know, you just knew that this
That's
was
right.
somebody that you should listen to and feel what he was telling you was good for you.
Right. You know, the president of Damon College was a Catholic. This goes back I don't know how many years. He told a professor there, who was a neighbor of mine, that he once was, what do they call that, flipping the channels, and then he sees this rabbi speaking. He says, I didn't understand a word, but I was mesmerized for a few hours. He would just sit there and watch it, a Catholic, for a few hours.
Well, you would see thousands of men just sitting there, just
Right.
shaking with pleasure,
Yeah, there was
because
an
they
incredible
understood what he
experience.
said. And
Right.
then afterwards, when they were able to find somebody to explain and talk about what he said, you realized how important it was.
Yeah, the Rebbe would talk sometimes for 6-7 hours,
Right.
interspersed with singing. and he would cover like a 10, 12 different topics, and everything was extemporaneous. I mean, he didn't have any text in front of him and he would quote hundreds of sources, and it was done with such simplicity. I mean, the Rebbe spoke. There was no pretenses that. Yeah. Okay. Any questions on the Zoom? Any Zoomies?